In this video, I'm going to go over all the settings I use when I'm out capturing images of birds in flight. So of course camera settings are pretty general, and 99% of what I talk about in this video will work on any camera, but there'll be a couple of settings towards the end of the video which are more specific to the Canon cameras and also the Sigma lens that I'm using, but you can of course adapt them and set up the equivalent settings in your own camera. But just to give you some information regarding what I use when I'm doing wildlife photography, I've got the Canon 5D Mark IV, which is a full frame camera, and I'm also using the Sigma 150 to 600mm contemporary lens. So I work in manual mode when I'm doing wildlife photography. I just like the control it offers. And I'm going to cover first of all, of course, the exposure triangle, my shutter speed, aperture and ISO. So when I'm capturing images of birds in flight, the shutter speed that I like to start at is 1/1250th of a second, and I generally work between that and 1/2000th of a second. The faster the shutter speed, the better for freezing motion. But of course it all depends on your lighting conditions and how high you're happy raising your ISO and so on. In terms of aperture, I am quite happy photographing at f6.3. I've captured many nice images at that setting, but if you want to get a bit more depth of field, f7.1 and f8 are common apertures I use as well. So that's mainly the range that I'm in. In terms of ISO, I take two approaches to that. I work in evaluative metering mode, or matrix metering mode as it's known in some camera brands. And if possible, before I actually start photographing the birds, I'll take a few test shots, get my exposure set correctly using manual ISO, and I just set that to balance the exposure triangle, get my exposure set up correctly. However, if I'm in changeable lighting conditions, for example today the sun is coming and going behind clouds, I quite like using auto ISO, so I don't need to worry about it, and I find that generally works pretty well. So the next setting that you need to change in your camera is to ensure that it's in continuous autofocus mode. That simply means that as you're tracking the bird in flight, as long as you've got focus held down on the bird, the camera is going to be continually focusing. In conjunction with that, I like to use back button focusing. So my shutter release simply takes the image, but I'm holding down back button focus and continually focusing on my subject as it moves through the air. The next setting that you want to change is to ensure that your camera is in continuous high-speed shooting mode, and that just ensures you're capturing as many shots per second as is possible. Regarding focus points, most of the time I'm working with a single focus point, the one in the center obviously. That lets me track most birds. However, if a bird is further away or it's a smaller bird and for some reason I'm having difficulty tracking it, I like to use what's called AF point expansion. So as well as the center focus point, I've got a number around that. Typically I most often work with 5 total focus points. I've got the center one and then 4 around it in a cross formation. So that generally helps in situations where you're struggling to maintain focus on the bird. So those are most of the core settings that you need to get set up in order to take good images of birds in flight. But there's a couple of other things I'd like to show you as well that I set up in my camera. Some are quite specific to this Canon camera, but you will probably have equivalent settings in other brands, and also some settings on the Sigma lens as well. So one of the settings that I like to change in my Canon camera has to do with the AI servo characteristics and the autofocus system. So you can find it in the autofocus menu, and you get 6 presets here, but I actually like to adjust one of these for doing my bird in flight photography. So if you go into one of them here, you've got 3 options. We've got tracking sensitivity, acceleration, deceleration tracking, and AF point auto switching. So for the first one here, tracking sensitivity, I like to set it at -2. In simple terms, this means there's less chance of focus going off your bird and onto the background, or if something else cuts across the path between yourself and the bird, there's less chance of the camera trying to jump on and focus to that. So I like it at -2. Next is the acceleration deceleration tracking. So for birds that's moving around quite erratically, changing direction, etc. quickly, this helps the camera keep up with that. And then down at the bottom one, AF point auto switching. This only works if you've got more than one focus point active. So if you're using, for example, AF point expansion that I talked about earlier, perhaps using 5 focus points or more, this helps the camera go between those more quickly. So I set that at +2 so it can happen as quick as possible. One last thing that I find very useful to do in my Canon camera is make use of the custom shooting modes. I'm often out shooting landscapes as well as wildlife and birds in flight, so the settings are obviously very different for those 2 different types of photography. So once I've entered all the settings that I want for my wildlife photography, I can go into the little wrench icon here, into number 5, menu option 5, and you can save all your settings to one of the custom modes that you can access on this dial here. So I set all of those into my C1 setting. You just register them like this. Now I can easily switch from my manual mode settings, which are typically around the base settings I'll start off at for landscape photography, and when I go out to do some wildlife photography, I simply turn the dial, select C1, and that's me got all the wildlife settings I talked about throughout the video ready to use and set up in the camera. So there's a few switches on the side of the Sigma lens. You'll probably have equivalent settings on your own lens, and it can help your bird in flight photography to change a few of these as well. So obviously we want the focus on autofocus. Here we've got the focus range limiter, so I always set that at 10 meters to infinity. If I know there's going to be nothing closer to me than 10 meters, that saves the camera trying to focus in that range. And it also makes the camera focus quicker on more distant subjects. Then we've got the optical stabilizer. Now with the fast shutter speeds that I talked about earlier, that's not really going to help, and it will only drain your camera battery, so I always turn that off. So that covers all the settings that you need to be aware of to capture good images of birds in flight. I'll just finish off by saying I do all my shooting of birds in flight handheld. I just find that works best for me. I can react quicker. It saves me carrying a tripod as well because I'm often moving around. I hope you found this video useful. I hope you found some of the settings helpful, maybe picked up some tips, and I'll see you in my next video.